I stood there, my daughter's mocking words still ringing in my ears as she laughed with her husband. Why keep a useless old woman around? She didn't see me as her mother anymore, just an obstacle to her newfound wealth. But days later, she came crawling, her pride shattered, while I sat calmly with the real papers in my hands, papers that would undo everything they thought they'd taken from me. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The clink of crystal and the hum of self-congratulation filled the sunlit dining room of the Cole estate. Late summer light spilled through floor-to-ceiling windows, gilding the mahogany table where the family sat. Though family felt like a fragile word now. Margaret Cole stirred her coffee with the slow, steady hand of someone who had learned long ago not to flinch under fire. Her silver hair was pulled into a simple twist. Her blue eyes, once fierce across boardroom tables, now watched the scene before her with quiet calculation. At the head of the table, Olivia laughed. Sharp, performative, the kind that needed an audience. 12 million, she said, tapping the rim of her mimosa flute. Can you believe Daddy had that stashed away in that crusty old firm? She turned to Brandon, her husband, lounging beside her like he belonged in a cigar ad. I told you we'd finally get free of her rainy day nonsense. Brandon raised his glass in lazy celebration. To the good life, he grinned. Penthouses, no more Costco furniture, and that lakefront spot in Horseshoe Bay. His Rolex glinted as he pointed his glass toward Margaret. No offense, Mom, but Olivia's right. You've done your time. Margaret looked up slowly, her spoon resting against the edge of her cup. I wasn't aware I was incarcerated. Brandon chuckled and went back to his champagne. Olivia leaned in with mock sweetness, resting her manicured fingers on the linen cloth. Oh, Mother, you know what I mean. It's just, you've run your course. You should enjoy what time you have left, not hover over every decision like some dusty museum guard. Across the table, Sophia stiffened, her jaw clenched above her untouched grapefruit. Wow, she muttered under her breath, eyes flicking toward Margaret. Margaret said nothing. Her expression didn't change, but one hand quietly folded into a fist beneath the table. Olivia was on a roll now, legs crossed, fingers dancing around her mimosa. Look, I appreciate everything you did, back in the 80s, but it's a new era now. People want lifestyle, not legacies. And honestly, she gave a small, dismissive shrug. Who keeps an old woman on payroll when she's not producing anything? The silence was immediate. Brandon didn't even blink. Sophia looked down at her plate like it might rescue her. Margaret slowly reached for her water. Her hands were steady. When she spoke, her voice was light. So I've expired, have I? Olivia giggled. Don't take it so personally. Mom, it's just business. Ruth Parker, seated quietly at the far end, finally spoke. Her voice was dry as sandpaper. Funny, she said, coming from someone who's never read a contract in her life. Olivia shot her a look, but Ruth didn't blink. She tapped her temple once. You might want to remember who drew up your little inheritance package. Margaret turned slightly toward her old friend, just enough for Ruth to catch the barely there smile tugging at the edge of her mouth. Contracts? Brandon laughed. Please, everything's already cleared. Money's in the account. We already called the interior designer. Sophia finally spoke up, her voice low. You haven't even buried Grandpa properly yet. The room turned colder. Olivia rolled her eyes. We did the memorial. Don't be dramatic. Dad wouldn't have wanted a big cry fest. He left that behind when he built that empire. And now it's ours to live with. So let's actually enjoy it. Sophia looked at her grandmother. Are you okay? Margaret smiled gently. Of course, dear. I'm just watching the next generation rise. Olivia raised her glass again. To inheritance done right. And to moving forward. The toast was hollow. Even the sunlight felt dimmer now. Margaret took a final sip of her coffee and set the cup down carefully. Yes, she said quietly. Let's see how far you get. Ruth leaned over as the others chattered about champagne brands and realtors. She murmured just loud enough for Margaret to hear. They really think they've won. Margaret's smile deepened by a degree. They forgot who signed the final version. And from beneath the table, Sophia glanced up, eyes narrowing. She didn't know everything yet, but she'd seen enough to know this wasn't over. Not even close. The morning after the inheritance dinner, the house was silent. Eerily so. Margaret sat alone in her late husband's study, a room untouched since his passing. Mahogany shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound contracts, law books, and awards engraved with Michael Cole's name. She hadn't stepped inside in weeks, but today wasn't about mourning. A soft creak of the old office chair broke the quiet as Margaret sat down and unlocked the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet with a small brass key, one only she and Michael had ever used. Inside, 3 manila folders, a velvet pouch, and a slim brown envelope sealed with Michael's initials. She reached past the pouch and took the second folder. Asset Sale Agreement, Cole Holdings, 2021. She flipped it open. Page after page of dense legal text stared back at her. Footnotes, appendices, cross-referenced clauses. Then she found it, highlighted in Michael's faded yellow marker. Disbursement of beneficiary assets subject to conditional oversight by primary trustee, M. Cole Sr., secondary, M. Cole Jr. She read it again, then again. Her fingers didn't tremble, but her lips parted just slightly. The $12 million wasn't a simple inheritance. It was held under a trust clause that required her co-signature for any liquidation. Olivia hadn't inherited liquidity. She'd inherited locked capital, a gilded cage. Margaret leaned back slowly. "You arrogant child," she whispered. She reached for her phone. Ruth arrived 20 minutes later in tennis shoes and a Patagonia vest, her gray hair twisted into a bun that hadn't moved since 6 a.m. yoga. She dropped a coffee beside Margaret's elbow and raised her brow. "I assume this isn't a social call." Margaret slid the open folder across the desk. Ruth skimmed 3 pages, flipped once, then twice more. She let out a slow whistle. "Clause 36. Classic Daniel." Margaret nodded. "She thinks she owns it all." "She owns nothing. It's like giving a toddler a toy car and telling her she's licensed." Margaret's eyes glinted. She toasted to moving forward. Ruth smirked. "They're going to trip over every inch of fine print. That's the noose. You tied it." By afternoon, Daniel Whitmore arrived, briefcase in hand and jaw already tight. A lifetime of high-stakes contract law had aged him into stone. Smart, cold, and utterly unfazed by family drama. He didn't shake hands. He sat, opened the file, and read in silence. "Did Olivia sign the beneficiary paperwork herself?" he asked without looking up. "She did. At Michael's insistence. No red lines, no attorney present. She wanted it fast." Daniel allowed himself a dry chuckle. "Fast is how people fall." He turned to the final clause and tapped the table. "This is a hard lock. No withdrawals without your authorization. Not for a boat, not for a purse, not for air." Margaret's lips pressed into a line. Daniel folded the file closed and looked up. "They're about to learn what wealth with rules really means." Margaret nodded once. "Let them." That evening, Margaret sat across from Sophia in the kitchen. The girl had changed into joggers and a hoodie, her hair pulled up in a messy bun. She scrolled on her tablet while sipping almond milk, clearly waiting for something to happen. "You were quiet last night," Margaret said gently. Sophia looked up. "Because it was gross." Margaret tilted her head. "You said nothing when she insulted me." Sophia's expression softened. "Because I didn't want to interrupt what's clearly unfolding." Margaret's eyes narrowed, curious. Sophia set her tablet down. "You didn't react," which usually means something's already in motion. A slow smile crept across Margaret's face. "You're very much your grandfather's granddaughter." Sophia leaned in slightly. "Does she actually have the money?" "No," Margaret said, voice like stone. "She only thinks she does." Sophia exhaled, grinning. So we're, what? Waiting? We're watching, Margaret replied. And when she moves, she'll step straight into it. Sophia stood and poured herself more almond milk. I won't say a word. Not even to your friends? Not even to my therapist. Margaret raised her glass. Good girl. The Maserati dealership gleamed like a showroom of power fantasy. White tile floors, massive LED displays, and espresso machines that cost more than most used cars. Olivia stood in 4-inch heels, sunglasses perched in her hair, spinning the key fob of her soon-to-be toy between two fingers. Rosso Magma, she said, flashing a tight smile at the salesman. That's the one. The coupe, not the convertible. Convertibles are for girls trying too hard. Brandon nodded behind her, distracted by a cigar app on his phone. Buy it outright. We don't need payments hanging over us. Exactly, Olivia said. Wire transfer, full amount, today. The salesman, a polished 30-something named Chase, clapped his hands together like he'd just won a cruise. Fantastic. We'll process the paperwork. Which bank should we expect funds from? Cedar Grove Trust. Margaret's guy manages the back end. Just call them and initiate. Of course. Olivia turned to Brandon with a smirk. She's probably knitting somewhere. No idea the wheels are already turning. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Then 30. By the 40-minute mark, Chase returned with a forced smile and the energy of someone about to deliver a root canal. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Cole. There seems to be an issue with the account. Olivia blinked. What kind of issue? The wire was flagged and blocked pending compliance review. The account's currently under temporary hold status. Brandon stood up. What the hell does that mean? Chase shifted nervously. The bank said it's internal. Something about disbursement restrictions and co-signature flags. I can have our finance office follow up. Olivia stepped forward, face flushed. I just moved $12 million into that account. Do I look like someone who needs permission to spend her own money? Chase raised both hands slightly. I understand, but the account's frozen. Legally, I can't release the vehicle without confirmed payment. Behind her, a couple in gym clothes paused, watching. Brandon's voice rose. Get the manager. Chase nodded and disappeared. Olivia's eyes darted around. The floor-to-ceiling windows now felt like glass walls at a zoo. She crossed her arms tightly, her manicured fingers twitching against her bicep. Her voice dropped. Call Evans. Right now. Brandon opened his phone, dialing the banker's number. Voicemail. He tried again. Straight to voicemail. Unbelievable, he muttered. The manager returned 5 minutes later, along with 2 more sales reps. Smiles tight, tone measured. Unfortunately, we have to cancel today's transaction. We'll hold the vehicle on file for 72 hours, should the funds clear. And just like that, Olivia Cole, the woman who once wore Dior to a dog park, was being escorted from a Maserati dealership like a broke teenager with a bad credit score. Across town, Margaret sat on the back porch of her home, a pair of worn leather gloves on her hands as she sprinkled seed into the wooden bird feeder. A cardinal landed on the branch just above her shoulder. She watched it for a moment before returning to her task. Ruth leaned against the railing, holding a lemonade in one hand and wearing her satisfaction like perfume. Did you hear it? She asked. That sound? Margaret didn't look up. What sound? The bubble. Popping. Ruth sipped. I swear it echoed all the way from the dealership. Margaret set the seed bag down. She thought money moves just because she snaps her fingers. Arrogance is so boring when it's predictable. Margaret glanced up at the sky, where clouds were beginning to shift over the Texas sun. This is only the first knot. Ruth smiled. Tighten it slowly. She'll feel every twist. Later that evening, Olivia slammed the door to her home office, pacing like a caged animal. I want that man fired, she snapped at Brandon, who was flipping through a folder of landscaping options. You think he works for us? He muttered. He answers to the trust. That's still under her name. Olivia stopped cold. Her face changed. You said it was mine. Brandon finally looked up. Yeah, and I believed it. But either Evans is screwing us or your mother just played us. Olivia's phone buzzed. She grabbed it. A message from Sophia. Just one line. Hope the test drive was fun. Grandma says hi. 2 days after the Maserati meltdown, Olivia strutted into the coal estate like she owned the place. Because she was convinced she did. She wore a fitted cream blazer, oversized sunglasses, and the brittle kind of smile reserved for daytime court shows and tabloid settlements. In her hand, a thick white envelope bearing a gold-stamped seal from some budget law office Brandon had Googled at 2 a.m. Margaret was in the sunroom, trimming dead leaves from her potted lavender when Olivia flung the double doors open. Found something fun in the mail, Olivia said, voice bright as broken glass. Thought you'd appreciate a little heads up. She tossed the envelope onto the table. It landed beside the shears with a soft slap. Margaret didn't flinch. What's this? Eviction notice, Olivia said, pulling off her sunglasses. As executor of Dad's estate and primary heir, I'm asserting my legal right to take control of the property. You've had your time, Mom. She turned to Brandon, who hovered in the hallway holding a second copy like a trophy. Margaret opened the envelope slowly. Her eyes skimmed the boilerplate text. Filed in your name? And his, Olivia said, with a nod toward Brandon. It's time we reclaimed what's ours. There was a long pause. Margaret turned the last page, then looked up, completely unfazed. Whose idea was this? Brandon stepped in. It's basic estate logic. You pass the business to us. That includes assets. The house is part of the asset list, yeah? From the hallway, Sophia appeared. Silent, phone in hand, camera already rolling. She said nothing as she leaned against the doorframe. Margaret sighed. You don't even know what you're standing in. Olivia smirked. A house I now own. No, Margaret said softly. You're tenants in my shadow. She reached for her phone and tapped 2 buttons. Within minutes, Daniel Whitmore appeared on video, his face angular and irritated on the screen. Hi, Daniel, Margaret said sweetly. Would you mind reviewing something? She held the document up to the camera. Daniel squinted, adjusted his glasses, and exhaled with a sharp, dry breath. This is garbage. Olivia stiffened. Excuse me? Daniel didn't even look at her. The house was transferred into a living trust 7 years ago. Sole trustee, Margaret Cole. Michael never touched the deed after that point. No beneficiary, heir, or executor can alter trust-held property unless the trust is dissolved. He blinked once. Which it isn't. Brandon stepped forward. But we were told. You were told by someone who doesn't understand asset law. Daniel snapped. This document is not only invalid, it's borderline fraudulent. Silence. Ruth, who had just wandered in with a glass of iced tea, burst out laughing. Oh, she said, this isn't eviction, it's exposure. Brandon's ears turned crimson. He looked at Olivia like she'd handed him a live grenade. Olivia narrowed her eyes. You're lying. Daniel arched a brow. I bill $900 an hour to avoid that risk. Brandon dropped the paper on the floor. Unbelievable. You dragged me into this stunt for what? Revenge? Ego? It was supposed to work, Olivia snapped. Margaret stood, stepping into the full light of the sunroom window, a quiet force of calm amid the storm. You two keep confusing possession with ownership. You might live here, but you've never earned a single inch of this house. Brandon clenched his fists. I'm done. He turned and stormed out, slamming the front door behind him hard enough to rattle the frames. Olivia stood frozen, unsure where to direct her rage. Sophia tapped her phone screen and pocketed it. Margaret glanced her way. Recording? Sophia shrugged. Just in case they get creative again. Olivia's lips curled. You're on her side now? Sophia stared at her mother evenly. You don't have sides. You have scenes, and this one's over. The next morning, Margaret stood in her kitchen with the French press still dripping, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. The silence of the house felt thicker than usual, almost anticipatory. She didn't flinch when her phone rang. Mr. Evans. She tapped accept and lifted the phone to her ear. I was going to wait until noon. His voice came quietly. But you need to see this. Margaret stepped into her study, already opening the email notification that pinged just as he spoke. Attached was a scanned loan agreement. Her eyes narrowed. She recognized the format instantly. Cedar Grove Trust's internal loan memo, usually used for high net worth credit lines. But it wasn't hers. It was Brandon's. 12 million collateralized against a trust-controlled account, against her signature. Except the signature wasn't hers. She stared at it. Same curve, same looped M, but wrong pressure, wrong angle. Sloppy. Forged. Evans's voice remained steady. He pushed the loan through 6 weeks ago, said it was pre-approved. Internal errors on our side didn't catch the trustee validation because the file was pulled manually. Margaret's voice was ice. You gave him money off my authorization? We gave him a line of credit. He hasn't drawn the full amount, but the collateralized portion is under risk review now that your co-signature was flagged during yesterday's account freeze. Margaret leaned forward, her voice calm but lethal. What happens next? There's a compliance review, fraud investigation, legal referral, and depending on exposure, the fund could be seized by the bank for default risk. How much did he already use? About $3.4 million. Margaret didn't blink. Start the seizure. An hour later, Daniel Whitmore stood in the same sunroom where yesterday's eviction disaster had played out, now flipping through the forged loan documents with clinical detachment. Forgery this obvious is amateur hour, he muttered. They used your scan from the 2019 quarterly report. It's not even vector matched. Just pasted. Sophia peeked over his shoulder. So that's prison stuff? Daniel cracked a rare smirk. It's definitely felony stuff. He handed the file back to Margaret. Want me to draft the fraud claim? Margaret shook her head slowly. Let the bank do their part first. They will. Once the seizure hits, Brandon will crawl back with an apology printed on gold leaf. Sophia sat down beside her grandmother, her voice quiet. They're already bleeding. Margaret took a long sip of tea before setting it down gently. Let them bleed dry. From the hallway, Ruth wandered in, waving a single rosemary branch like a wand. Did I miss something? Sophia grinned. Only the part where Grandpa's empire just chomped back. Ruth raised an eyebrow. Ah, my favorite part. Daniel's phone buzzed. He checked it, then turned the screen to Margaret. A bank notification. Actioned. Cedar Grove Trust has initiated seizure of collateral funds. Balance, $12,000. Consators. Status, frozen. Margaret nodded once. That's the heart, Daniel said. Stopped cold. Sophia leaned back, stunned. They're gonna lose everything. Ruth laughed, full and rich. Patience is profit, darling. You're watching a masterclass. Across town, Brandon stood barefoot in their rented kitchen, staring blankly at the ceramic tile as Olivia read the bank notice aloud. No, 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 this can't be real, he muttered, pacing in small circles. They can't take it. That's our money. That was ours. Olivia's voice cracked. They froze the account. Everything's gone. They think you forged her signature. I didn't forge. Okay, I did. But it wasn't. Jesus, I thought she'd never look. She threw the phone across the room. You ruined us. You said it was untouchable. I said it was mine. You said you knew what you were doing. Then why did you sign off? I didn't. You dragged my name into this. The yelling bounced off the marble walls, their echo the only response. Their home, rented, not owned, suddenly felt smaller, trapped, cornered, defenseless. That night, Margaret sat on the back porch again, watching the moon rise through a veil of drifting clouds. Sophia joined her with a blanket and a quiet look. They're unraveling, the girl said softly. Margaret didn't answer right away. She watched a pair of doves land near the feeder. No, she said finally. They're being revealed. Monday morning arrived with the kind of sky that couldn't decide between storm and sun. Inside their rental home, Olivia stood at the kitchen island with her laptop open, biting down on her thumbnail as she refreshed the banking portal for the 5th time. Still zero. Her throat tightened. She clicked to the detailed balance history, scrolling through rows of grayed-out transactions, each now flagged with a bright red hold. Even the petty cash subaccount had been sealed. Her voice came out as a whisper. "It's gone." From across the room, Brandon looked up from a pile of unopened envelopes. "What?" "The money," she said, staring at the screen like it might blink first. "All of it. Every cent. Frozen, flagged, or seized. They wiped us out." Brandon dropped the envelope he was holding. "That's not possible. They can't just take it." "They didn't take it," Olivia snapped. "She did." The doorbell rang. Brandon didn't move. It rang again. Longer this time. He walked to the door and opened it to a man in a cheap suit holding a thick folder. "Mr. Reed?" the man asked. Brandon nodded warily. "You've been served." The folder was placed directly into his hand. "Past due balance on a leveraged line tied to restricted trust funds. Your lender has initiated formal collections proceedings." Brandon just stood there, eyes blank. The man nodded, turned, and left without another word. Brandon looked down at the papers, then back at Olivia. "I told you to wait. I said we needed time." "No, Brandon," Olivia growled. "You said you had it handled. You forged a signature. You gambled with $12 million. And now we have debt collectors knocking on a rental door." He flung the papers onto the kitchen counter and stepped back, voice rising. "You let me do it." She threw a glass across the room. It shattered against the backsplash. "I'm going to sue her," Olivia hissed. "I don't care how old she is. I'll drag her to court in front of everyone. I will burn that house to the ground if I have to." Back in Austin's quiet suburbs, Margaret sipped her tea on the wraparound porch. A wisteria vine curled lazily along the column beside her, blooming in slow, deliberate defiance of August heat. Her shawl was wrapped neatly around her shoulders, and her silence was the most luxurious thing in the world. Sophia sat beside her, cradling a mug of herbal tea she hadn't touched. Her face was unreadable, but her posture gave her away. Tucked in, protective. A girl caught between two worlds, finally choosing one. Margaret finally spoke. "Is she talking lawsuit yet?" "Just started yelling about it this morning," Sophia said quietly. "Threatened to torch the family name." "She already did." Sophia reached out and hugged her. No fanfare, no words. Just warmth. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. Ruth appeared at the top of the stairs with 2 bags of seed and a half-finished crossword in her hand. "Well," she called, "looks like your daughter's financial acrobatics got her stuck midair." Margaret smiled. "With no net." Ruth sat with a huff. "They called you useless. Now they're priceless." Sophia glanced up. "What?" Ruth grinned. "Worth nothing." They all laughed softly, a quiet, rich sound that felt earned. Meanwhile, Olivia sat in the corner of the living room floor, her phone in one hand, a crumpled tissue in the other. The ceiling fan above her spun in slow, mocking rhythm. She scrolled through contacts and paused over Daniel Whitmore's name, then Evans, then Margaret. No one would answer. No one would help. She tapped in the number for a boutique law firm she remembered from a gala years ago. Someone expensive. The kind with a glass office and a ferocious reputation. A receptionist answered. "I need a litigator," Olivia snapped. "It's urgent. Family estate fraud. I'm being sabotaged." There was a pause. "And your name, ma'am?" "Olivia Cole." Another pause. Longer this time. "I'm sorry," the woman said politely. "Our firm already represents Mrs. Margaret Cole and Cedar Grove Trust. Conflict of interest applies. We can't assist you." Click. The Travis County Courthouse didn't feel like the kind of place Olivia Cole belonged. Its beige walls, fluorescent lights, and cracked vinyl benches weren't built for power suits and pearls. But here she was, chin high, heels sharp, wearing a cream blazer that screamed innocent but important. Her eyes scanned the crowd like she was still shopping for allies. Brandon sat beside her, pale and damp around the collar, his tie knotted too tight. He kept glancing at the courtroom doors like maybe he could escape before this all began. Too late. Across the aisle, Margaret entered with quiet poise, flanked by Daniel Whitmore and Sophia. No theatrics, no smug glances, just calm presence and tailored dignity. Margaret wore navy, not black, because grief wasn't her story anymore. Control was. The clerk called the case, Cole v. Cole. Claim, intentional sabotage of inheritance, breach of fiduciary trust. The judge, a seasoned woman with years of probate cases behind her eyes, barely looked up as she flipped through the initial filings. Plaintiff? Opening statement? Olivia stood, voice louder than necessary. Your Honor, I am the rightful heir to my father's estate. What was meant to be my financial future was tampered with, sabotaged by my mother, who manipulated trust clauses and used her position to seize what was lawfully mine. She gestured toward Margaret, like she were pointing out a trespasser at a country club. She exploited technicalities and weaponized the fine print of the estate to punish me for personal disagreements. But the spirit of the will, my father's intent, was clear. I was to inherit Cole Holdings' assets, which included all financial disbursements. The judge glanced over her glasses. Did you sign the beneficiary documents without review? Olivia blinked. I trusted my family. I didn't expect sabotage from my own mother. Defense? Daniel stood with the energy of a man used to dismantling weak structures with surgical ease. He pulled a single folder from his briefcase and laid it flat. Your Honor, here are the original estate documents. The plaintiff signed a trust agreement that clearly outlines disbursement restrictions, which explicitly require dual authorization, meaning Margaret Cole's signature, for any withdrawals or asset movement. That language is not vague. It's absolute. He turned to Olivia. She signed these voluntarily. No duress. No deception. He slid another document forward. This is the forensic analysis of the loan documents Brandon Reed submitted to Cedar Grove Trust, complete with a forged co-trustee signature lifted from a public quarterly statement. Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sweat collecting along his temples. Daniel continued. The bank initiated seizure as a result of fraud. My client didn't steal funds. She protected them. According to both trust law and the estate's legal terms, she acted not only within her rights, but within her responsibilities. The judge nodded. Call your witness. Sophia rose from the second row, steady as ever. She approached the stand and sat down. Daniel's tone softened. Sophia, you were present for the reading of the will and its subsequent events. Can you describe your mother and stepfather's behavior in the weeks that followed? Sophia didn't flinch. They were reckless, arrogant. They talked about spending the money before the ink on the paperwork had dried. My mom said my grandmother was expired. Brandon called the trust old lady strings. They didn't see it as a responsibility. Just fuel. The courtroom was quiet. Daniel nodded. Thank you. He turned to the judge. No further questions. Olivia stood again, breath shaky. She's just a child. She's been manipulated. The judge held up a hand. Enough. She closed the folder. What I see here is a misinterpretation of entitlement as ownership. This court does not rewrite contracts to satisfy disappointment. If you failed to read your own documents, that's not sabotage. That's negligence. Her gavel tapped once. Motion to dismiss. Granted. Bang. Just like that, it was over. Brandon's head dropped. Olivia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Margaret didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She simply stood, gathered her coat, and turned toward the aisle. Sophia followed. They passed Olivia in silence. No glance exchanged. Outside, cameras waited. Brandon ducked behind a pillar. Olivia froze in the sun, 1,000 lenses pointed at her. Behind her, someone asked, "Is it true you tried to evict your mother?" She blinked. Margaret stepped into a waiting car, the door held open by Daniel. She looked out the window for a moment, meeting Olivia's eyes through the glass. Then she was gone. The conference room reeked of cheap cologne and stale cigar smoke. Brandon sat at the scratched glass table flanked by two men who hadn't smiled since they walked in. One wore a blazer 2 sizes too small. The other had a toothpick between his lips and a scar across his temple. Both had the kind of stillness that made Brandon's knee bounce harder. "Short-term float," he said, voice cracking slightly. "Just to cover immediate obligations. I've got property in the pipeline. Once it's liquid, we settle." The smaller man leaned forward, folding his hands. "You mean the penthouse you used to live in?" Brandon's throat tightened. "That was a paperwork issue. We're resolving it." Toothpick guy didn't blink. "You showed up broke, borrowed a Bentley to get here, and pitched us a $12 million fairy tale. Sounds like a trust fund sob story wrapped in fraud." Brandon laughed nervously. "This isn't fraud, it's leverage, strategic timing. Look." He slid a worn business card across the table. "Michael Cole was my father-in-law. You know Cole Holdings. He built half the mid-market energy sector in Austin. We're not nobodies. We just had a temporary liquidity freeze." The men exchanged a glance. Then one spoke. 5,000 max. Weekly interest. 40%. Brandon's face fell. "That's all?" he said. "I need at least 50 grand. I have contractors, car payments, furniture orders." "Not our problem." Brandon clenched his jaw. "What if I brought collateral?" "Like what?" "Leads. Access. A name you might want." "Go on." Brandon lowered his voice. "Margaret Cole." The room changed. Toothpick guy took the stick from his mouth and set it on the table. "Be careful," he said. Brandon's eyes narrowed. "She's got assets buried in layered trusts. Real estate. Old money. If someone leaned hard enough." The man stood. The conversation was over. Across town, Olivia hurled a crystal vase at the wall. It shattered like glass gilt. "We were supposed to be untouchable," she screamed, pacing barefoot through the living room. "Your job was to think. And instead, you're talking to guys who carry knives like they're wallets?" Brandon rubbed his temples. "You said we needed cash. You were screaming about lawyers." "I meant lawyers, not leg breakers. Jesus, Brandon." He dropped into the armchair, deflated. "I'm trying. Every door is closed. Banks, lines, friends. Your name burns down phone calls." She sat on the edge of the coffee table, eyes manic. "We need leverage. Dirt. Something that breaks her image. She's not a saint." Brandon looked up, slow and bitter. "Yeah? Then find it." In Margaret's study, Daniel scanned new intel on Brandon's loan meetings. He clicked the speakerphone. "Do you want to file charges now?" he asked. Margaret stood at the window watching squirrels dance through the trees. "Not yet." Daniel frowned. "He's approaching high-risk lenders. If he connects her name to one of them, and they're stupid enough to act on it." "They won't," Margaret said. "Why not?" "Because they may be predators, but they aren't fools. They don't hunt things with sharp teeth." Daniel leaned back. "You think fear's enough?" "I think the right silence is louder than any threat." Ruth flipped through the evening paper, cackling softly over the crossword. "Brandon's digging his own grave." Sophia looked up from her laptop. "He's panicking." "Good," Ruth said. "Let him." Sophia hesitated, then pulled up a file. "I recorded something," she said. Margaret and Ruth turned. "It was last night. He was screaming at Mom. Said he'd burn her world down if someone gave him the match." "You got it on video?" Ruth asked. Sophia nodded. "Clear audio. Time-stamped." Margaret didn't speak. She reached for her tea. "Keep it," she said, "in case he forgets who taught him the rules." Sophia tilted her head. "You think he'll try something reckless?" Margaret smiled faintly. "He already has." The video aired just after the 5 o'clock news. Local channel, evening slot, right between a segment on rising mortgage rates and a fluff piece about a rescued puppy. The clip was just under 30 seconds. No fancy graphics. No dramatic music. Just a raw, unedited audio overlay. paired with stills of Brandon and Olivia from charity events and gala nights. "I'll burn her world down if someone gives me the match." Brandon's voice, clear, angry, unmistakable. The station's legal correspondent added minimal commentary. "The man in the recording is Brandon Reed, son-in-law of Margaret Cole, former CEO widow of Cole Holdings. The context of the threat remains under review, but sources suggest this relates to ongoing estate disputes and recent financial controversies." No spin, no defense, just exposure. The social fallout was instant. By morning, Olivia's phone had stopped ringing. Texts went unanswered. Emails went from invitations to icy silence. Her Instagram followers dropped by 10,000 in a single night. Luxury brand reps quietly removed her from PR lists. An art gallery rescinded her RSVP. Her name was no longer an asset, it was a liability. She stood by the fireplace scrolling through old DMs like they were a casualty list. One by one, blue checkmarks vanished. Across the room, Brandon sat slumped at the dining table, his phone face down, his knuckles white. "Why would she release that?" he asked. Olivia didn't look up. "Because it works." Brandon stood, pacing. "That was private. That was rage. No court would convict me on that. No court needed to," Olivia said bitterly. "You gave her a match. She lit it. Now we burn." Back at the Cole estate, the mood was soft and still. Margaret sat in her favorite chair by the window, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the horizon. She hadn't spoken much all day, not after the clip aired, not after the media requests rolled in, not even when the neighbors began whispering over fences and hedges. She didn't need to speak. She had already spoken in silence. Sophia sat at her feet on the floor, leaning against the chair like a child again. Her laptop glowed in her lap, unread emails piling up. She looked up. "Are you okay?" Margaret reached over and gently brushed a loose strand of hair from her granddaughter's face. "They're slower now," she said softly. "They're staggering." Sophia nodded. "Ruth says they look like roaches under a kitchen light." Margaret smiled. Right on cue, Ruth entered the room with a fresh glass of mint water and a file folder in hand. "They're slowed," she said, setting it down. "Now crush them." Margaret's eyes flicked to the file. "Foreclosure notice. Final." Sophia sat up. "The penthouse?" "Yup," Ruth said, popping a mint into her mouth. "It hits public auction next Friday. Starting bid, $1. Margaret opened the folder and scanned the lines. Sophia leaned in. "You're really going to buy it?" Margaret closed the folder. "I already did." Later that evening, Olivia stepped into her old penthouse building like a ghost. Her heels clicked across the polished marble of the lobby she once ruled. No doorman greeted her. No concierge smiled. She took the elevator up alone, stomach tight. Brandon had stayed behind. He didn't want to see the place stripped bare, but Olivia needed to. Needed to believe there was something left. A painting, a chair, a single damn pillow. The door opened, and she froze. Inside, soft jazz played from hidden speakers. Fresh lilies stood in a vase on the foyer table. A bottle of Perrier sat chilling in a marble bowl. And standing by the window, watching the city burn pink under the dusk, Margaret, wearing navy silk, sipping water, calm as the moon. Olivia's mouth dropped open. "How?" Margaret didn't turn. "I assume you remember the square footage," she said. "You spent enough time bragging about it." Olivia stepped forward. "You can't. This is mine." Margaret finally turned, slowly, like she had all the time in the world. "It was?" she said. "Before the bank reclaimed it. Before they listed it under a shell trust." She held up a silver key, spinning it once on her finger. "And before I bought it." Olivia's knees buckled slightly. She gripped the wall. "You don't need this place." "No," Margaret said. "But I earned it." The eviction notice arrived on a Thursday morning, folded neatly inside a certified envelope stamped by the Travis County clerk. Brandon opened it. still half asleep, and read the first 3 lines before the blood drained from his face. Unlawful detainer? He muttered aloud. Olivia, sitting at the breakfast bar in a wrinkled robe, looked up from her laptop. What are you talking about? He handed her the notice. She read it once, then again. The final paragraph hit like a blunt object. The property located at 4901 Hanover Penthouse West has been transferred to Trust Entity 724C, currently in full legal possession. You are hereby ordered to vacate the premises within 72 hours. Her hands shook. She flipped the page. The listed trustee? Margaret Cole. It was front-page news by Friday morning. Heiress evicted from former penthouse. Matriarch buys it for $1 through trust. Uptown royalty falls. Olivia Cole booted from luxury tower. Justice in silk. Widow Margaret Cole reclaims empire, 1 floor at a time. The photos were damning. Olivia standing outside the building in oversized sunglasses and fury-stiff posture. Brandon ducking into a car like a washed-up CEO after a tax raid. Movers carrying out gilded frames and forgotten dreams under the flash of paparazzi bulbs. Inside, reporters weren't even subtle anymore. Mrs. Cole, do you regret trying to evict your mother? Mr. Reed, did you really forge estate documents? Olivia, how does it feel to be replaced in your own home? Their silence was louder than denial. They had no answers left. Upstairs, Margaret moved in without ceremony. No press release, no statements, just a single box of fresh lilies, a soft cashmere throw, a chilled bottle of Perrier in the marble bowl, replaced every evening. Sophia helped unpack, her quiet hands folding linen napkins and smoothing fresh sheets. The skyline outside glowed like it had never belonged to anyone else. She paused at the window. It feels full circle. Margaret stepped beside her, arms folded loosely. Not a circle, she said. A spiral. We return, but never to the same place. Sophia turned to her, eyes soft. Can I stay with you? Margaret smiled. You never had to ask. That night, the penthouse lights glowed from 12 floors up, a beacon of the new order. On the terrace, Ruth poured 2 glasses of champagne and set them on the bistro table. To useless old women, she said, clinking her glass gently against Margaret's. Margaret raised her own glass. We build while they burn. They sat in silence for a moment, letting the city hum beneath them. Inside, Sophia turned off the TV, silencing another news segment on the public downfall of Brandon Reed and Olivia Cole. She closed her laptop and padded barefoot into the kitchen to grab a lemon tart. Peace had weight now, but it also had momentum. Miles away, Olivia sat in the corner of a dim motel room, surrounded by half-packed suitcases and unanswered calls. Brandon paced like a dog in a cage, muttering numbers under his breath. Lenders, deadlines, costs he couldn't cover. Everything smelled like sour air and failure. Olivia's phone buzzed, an alert from a luxury design magazine she used to follow. She opened it, reflexively. There, smiling softly in front of the penthouse's grand piano, Margaret and Sophia. Caption: Grace, reclaimed. The Cole legacy continues. Olivia threw the phone across the room. It didn't break, but something inside her did. The morning sky was gray, heavy with a promise of rain. Outside the low-rise motel off I-35, a black government-issued SUV pulled into the parking lot with unhurried finality. It didn't need sirens. It didn't need lights. Just presence. Inside room 214, Brandon zipped his duffel bag with the mechanical rhythm of a man who still believed he had time. Olivia sat cross-legged on the stained bedspread, a mug of instant coffee cooling in her hands. Her face was blank, her hair pulled back with no effort. She hadn't spoken in an hour. There was a knock. Firm. Measured. Brandon's shoulders stiffened. Stay quiet, he whispered. Don't open it. The knock came again. This time, followed by the unmistakable sound of a key card unlocking, Brandon turned just in time to see the door swing open and 2 plainclothes officers step inside. Brandon Reed? He didn't answer. The first officer stepped forward and calmly produced the warrant. You are under arrest for financial fraud, document forgery, and trust fund misappropriation. He reached for his wrists. Brandon backed up. I didn't mean to. His voice cracked mid-sentence as the cold bite of metal closed around his wrists. Sir, you have the right to remain silent, the officer continued. Brandon didn't fight. He just stared at Olivia. Say something, he croaked. But Olivia didn't move. She just shook her head, slowly, as if even that took effort, and looked away. The officers guided Brandon through the door, his shoulders hunched against the weight of it all. As he passed the window, a camera flash fired outside. They'd been waiting. The courthouse gallery was packed by 10 a.m. Margaret sat in the front row of the gallery, her posture straight, her shawl folded neatly over her lap. The lighting above her glinted off her silver hair. She didn't look toward the defendant's bench once. Daniel sat beside her, flipping quietly through a manila folder stamped with the court seal. Today's a formality, he murmured. Plea agreement's in place. Judge just wants it on record. Margaret nodded once. Justice likes its paperwork. Behind her, Sophia sat between Ruth and a woman from the press. She wasn't smiling, but there was something settled in her eyes, like a tide that had finally turned. When Brandon entered in cuffs, the room buzzed. The once proud son-in-law of Cole Holdings now shuffled under fluorescent lights in a wrinkled gray blazer and court-issued shoes. His collar was open, his face was drawn. The man who once toasted penthouses now looked like a cautionary tale with a pulse. The clerk called the docket. State vs. Brandon Reed. Charges: forgery of legal documents, fraudulent misrepresentation of collateral, and trust fund abuse. The judge didn't bother with small talk. Brandon's lawyer entered the plea on his behalf. Guilty. The judge signed off. Sentencing to follow. One bang of the gavel, and it was done. Outside, Margaret stepped into the crisp autumn air, her breath visible in the cold. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras aimed like weapons, but no one dared block her path. Daniel held them at bay with a short press statement. No questions today. Justice was served. We're done here. Margaret kept walking, serene, whole. Sophia caught up beside her, cheeks pink with wind. You rewrote the will of fate, she whispered. Margaret's steps slowed, then resumed. No, she said softly. I just read it properly. Behind them, Ruth caught up, breathless but grinning. Hope no one thinks this is the end. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Why not? Because this is only Act 2, Ruth said, sliding on her sunglasses. Act 1 was loss. Act 2 is war. Act 3? Legacy. Margaret glanced toward Sophia. She's already writing it. Sophia gave a shy smile, and Margaret, finally, allowed herself a small one back. That night, Olivia sat alone on the floor of another temporary apartment, one suitcase half unpacked beside her, the walls bare, and the air stale. A news clip played faintly in the background, muted but unavoidable. Brandon Reed, husband of heiress Olivia Cole, entered a guilty plea today in a financial fraud case involving the misappropriation of trust assets belonging to the Cole Holdings estate. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Just 2 words. You're next. The penthouse was quiet that morning, washed in pale gold light. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm. Cars, trains, lives. But up here, time slowed. Margaret sat at the dining table, not the head of it, but slightly off-center, her fingers resting atop a thick leather-bound portfolio. Her posture was straight, her face unreadable. Daniel stood across from her, a silver pen clipped neatly to his lapel. Everything is ready, he said. We'll walk through it, line by line. Margaret nodded once. Start from the top. Sophia sat on the couch nearby, curled up with a blanket and a half-drunk mug of peppermint tea. She watched, quiet, alert. This wasn't a scene for the cameras. This was something sacred. Daniel opened the folder. Article 1. Revocation of all prior wills and testaments. Margaret didn't blink. Confirmed. Article 2. Estate Executor. Retained as Daniel Whitmore, with full discretionary authority. Confirmed. Article 3. Heirship. He paused. Would you like me to read it aloud? Margaret's voice was firm. Yes. Daniel read. I, Margaret Ruth Cole, being of sound mind and memory, do hereby declare that I leave no portion of my estate, financial assets, property, or legacy trusts to my daughter, Olivia Cole, as she has voluntarily severed all moral, fiduciary, and relational bonds by her own action. Sophia sat up straighter. Daniel continued. All holdings, including the Cole estate, residual corporate interests, intellectual property, and long-term equity positions, shall pass in full to my granddaughter, Sophia Cole, who has remained loyal, principled, and worthy of the Cole name. In addition, I direct the establishment of the Margaret and Michael Cole Women's Initiative Fund, seeded with an initial grant of $3 million to support education and entrepreneurship for underrepresented women across Texas. He paused. Final clause? Margaret nodded. Daniel flipped to the back. To my daughter, I leave this truth. Power is not inherited. It is earned, protected, and wielded with care. You failed at all three. Silence. Daniel set the file down, reached for his pen, and clicked it once. Signature. Margaret reached forward, deliberate. She signed with the same sharp, slanted strokes that had once closed 8-figure mergers. Daniel notarized the page, his seal hissing against the paper. It's done. Margaret exhaled. The kind of breath you only take when something final has settled deep inside you. Sophia stood slowly. She crossed to the table and sat beside her grandmother. You didn't have to do this, she whispered. I did, Margaret said, because it's not about what you inherit. It's about what you carry. Sophia swallowed hard. Margaret placed a hand on her granddaughter's. You carry it well. Later that day, Ruth arrived with lemon bars and a bottle of aged port. She set them on the table like communion. So, she said, eyes twinkling, you finally dropped the guillotine. Margaret nodded. It was never about revenge. It was about correction. Well, you corrected her clean out of the family. Sophia smiled weakly. It still feels big. It is big, Ruth said. But legacies don't grow in silence. They grow in soil, deep, turned, and sometimes a little bloody. Margaret raised a brow. That's poetic. I'm drinking early, Ruth replied, pouring 2 glasses. Sophia looked at the sealed folder now resting inside the safe behind Margaret's bookshelf. It's permanent now, she said softly. Isn't it? Margaret looked her in the eyes. Only if you make it matter. Sophia nodded. She would. It happened on a Sunday, the kind of morning where the sky stayed undecided, caught between sun and storm, light and shadow. Margaret was finishing her second cup of black tea when she heard the knock. It wasn't firm. It wasn't rhythmic. It was soft, uncertain. Ruth appeared from the hallway first, barefoot and holding her crossword. You expecting someone? No. Another knock. This time followed by something Margaret hadn't heard in years. A sob. She stood, calm as always, and walked to the door. Through the beveled glass, a blurry silhouette. She opened it. And there, on the doormat where shoes usually waited, knelt Olivia, bare-kneed, mascara streaked, her coat too thin for the wind. The bags beneath her eyes were heavier than her luggage had ever been. I have nothing left, Olivia whispered. They froze my accounts. I can't even afford groceries. Margaret didn't speak. I was wrong, Olivia said, her voice breaking now. I thought I was strong. I thought I was smart. But everything I touched just... She looked up, her hands shaking. Please, help me. Mom. Sophia appeared behind her grandmother in the entryway. Silent. Ruth joined, leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed. Neighbors across the street paused, pretending to water plants or check their mail, all glancing up at the scene unfolding like live theater. Margaret's face didn't flinch. "You mocked me useless," she said, voice low but piercing. "You turned my silence into a target, my grief into a weakness. You thought being loud made you right." Olivia's shoulders shook. "I didn't know what I was doing, but I did," Margaret said sharply. "I built, I planned, I endured, and now I remain." A breeze lifted the hem of Olivia's coat. "I am not here to punish you, Olivia. Life's already done that," Margaret continued. "I'm here to preserve what's left." Olivia reached for her hand, but Margaret stepped back. "No." Tears streamed down Olivia's face. "I'm your daughter." "You were," Margaret replied. "Before you chose power over family, lies over legacy, greed over grace." Behind her, Sophia lifted her phone slowly and began filming, not out of spite, but record-keeping, history, proof. Because the world needed to see what truth looked like when it finally stood upright. Olivia noticed. "Are you filming this?" Sophia didn't answer. Ruth chuckled darkly from behind them, and she crawled. Olivia looked up at her mother one final time. "What am I supposed to do?" Margaret tilted her head, eyes steady. "What women have always done when the world stops clapping, start over, in silence, without applause." Then she closed the door. Gently, no slam, just finality. Inside, Sophia lowered the phone. Her hands were trembling. "Was that cruel?" she asked. Margaret didn't answer. She walked into the study, opened the safe, and pulled out a slim blue folder with a gold seal. She handed it to Sophia. "What is this?" Margaret tapped the cover. "An irrevocable endowment, $2 million, donated this morning to the Sophia Cole Women's Business Trust, for first-time female founders, starting next quarter." Sophia's jaw dropped. "In my name?" "You've earned it," Margaret said simply. Sophia opened the folder, scanning the numbers. "This could help hundreds of women." "Thousands," Ruth corrected, stepping in with 2 glasses of champagne. "To the next generation of women who don't wait for permission." She raised her glass. "To Sophia." Margaret joined her. "To legacy." Sophia blinked away tears, glass trembling in her grip. "To not becoming them." They clinked. Outside, the wind picked up as Olivia stumbled back to the sidewalk, her knees scraped, her pride in ruins. No one offered her a ride. No one looked away. Just a woman finally facing the consequences of burning bridges she never built. The auditorium wasn't large, but it was full. Every seat held a woman with a notebook, or a laptop, or a child on her hip. Some wore thrifted blazers, others dressed like they'd come from second jobs. All had shown up for one reason: the launch of the Sophia Cole Women's Business Trust. Banners lined the back wall, deep navy and gold, understated. A podium sat center stage, flanked by tall bouquets of wildflowers. No red carpet, no photographers, just focus. Sophia stood behind the mic, her palms damp against the sides of her note cards. She looked out at the crowd. Faces full of hope, ambition, nerves. Faces like hers, like her grandmother's. She exhaled. "My name is Sophia Cole," she began. "And I come from a family that taught me 2 things: how to hold power quietly and how to give it away boldly." There was soft applause, some nodding, a few tears already. "This fund," she continued, "was built with the belief that women shouldn't need a seat at someone else's table. They should own the damn table, and the building it sits in." Louder clapping now. A smile from the woman in the second row. Sophia looked down for a beat. "This fund was created in honor of someone who spent her life doing that, quietly, relentlessly, without applause." She glanced off stage. Margaret sat in the front row, composed as ever, wearing a gray silk wrap and a knowing expression. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her presence needed no microphone. Back on stage, Sophia finished. "Today, the first 12 grants go live. 12 women will walk out of here with the seed money to build something that matters. Applause thundered, not roaring, but resonant, like roots deepening. After the ceremony, people lingered. A woman in a courier jacket approached Margaret, tears in her eyes, clutching her approved application. "You don't know what this means," she whispered. Margaret only smiled. "I do." Outside, the local paper caught a photo of the three women standing beneath the navy and gold banner. Sophia, with her arm around Margaret, Ruth beside them with her signature leopard print scarf and sunglasses, lifting a paper cup of cider like it was Dom Perignon. The next morning's headline read, "Power Rewritten, the Coal Women Launch New Era of Legacy." The article highlighted the fund, the grants, and Margaret's long, quiet journey from widow to architect of something enduring. There was no mention of Olivia, not once. Her name had stopped appearing, even in gossip. At home, the penthouse was quiet. Margaret sat by the window with the newspaper folded neatly beside her. She stared out at the skyline, unbothered by the wind or the coming rain. Ruth walked in slowly, holding 2 cups of green tea. Her eyes were glassy, but her tone was dry. "Paper says you're a legend." Margaret smiled faintly. "It's just print." "No," Ruth said, sitting down beside her. "The divorce filings, the headlines, the lawsuits, that was noise." She tapped the photo of Sophia with a pen. "This," she added, "that's the real paper." Margaret didn't reply right away. She reached out, carefully folding the edge of the page until the faces of the 3 women lined up across the middle. Then she said, "Legacy isn't about who remembers your name. It's about what continues when you stop speaking." Behind her, Sophia walked in barefoot, holding a new binder, thicker now, filled with applicant profiles, business pitches, financial plans. She knelt beside Margaret and laid it on the table. "I want to double it next year," she said. "The fund. There are too many women who just need one door." Margaret looked at her. "You've already opened it." Ruth lifted her tea. "To doors, and to not needing keys anymore." They clinked gently. Outside, dusk fell across the city, its glow now tethered not to wealth or scandal, but to quiet women with open hands and sharp minds. The rain had started, slow and steady, like a hush falling across the city. In the heart of the penthouse, Margaret's study glowed with lamplight. The shelves were full, not just with books, but with proof. Ledgers, deeds, birth certificate, letters, paper that had outlived the people who signed it. She sat in her wingback chair, a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the faint ticking of the mantel clock keeping time. In her lap, a file marked with a silver seal, the final trust documents, the ones that mattered, the ones no one had thought she'd have the foresight or the strength to draft, to fight for, to hold. Across from her, Sophia sat on the rug, barefoot, binder open in her lap. Her eyes scanned line after line of clauses and contingency. It was the language of legacy, disguised in legalese. Most would have missed the poetry in it. But not Sophia. "You covered everything," she murmured. "Even guardianship of the initiative, contingency trusts, secondary disbursement locks if fraud is ever detected." Margaret smiled softly. "Experience teaches precision." Sophia looked up. "It's airtight." It had to be. At that moment, Ruth burst in holding a bottle of champagne and 3 antique flutes in her arms like contraband. Her scarf was crooked. Her grin was mischief. "Am I late to the quiet revolution?" Margaret didn't flinch. "You're right on time." Ruth popped the cork. It hit the ceiling with a satisfying thunk. Foam bubbled to the rim of each glass as she poured. She handed one to Margaret, one to Sophia, and raised her own. "To ink," she said, "and to the fools who thought it couldn't write legacies." They clinked. Margaret sipped, then leaned back in her chair, the sound of the rain tapping softly against the tall windows behind her. "When Michael died," she said, "I let silence protect me. I thought grief should be invisible, contained, I let them. She nodded towards some invisible past. Talk over my morning like it was static. She looked at Sophia. Never again. Sophia swallowed hard. You were never silent, she said. You were sharpening. Ruth grinned. With a fountain pen and a portfolio. Sophia turned the page in the binder. Clause 72, she read aloud, states that all public-facing assets and future grants will carry the family name, but not the family shame. Margaret raised an eyebrow. That one was mine. They laughed. Genuine, warm, tired in the best way. The fire crackled. The house didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like home again. Later that night, Sophia wandered into the living room with a throw blanket and sat by the grand piano. She didn't play. She just traced her fingers across the lid, like she was remembering something she hadn't yet lived. Margaret joined her, holding a worn envelope, creased, smudged, sealed. The original letter your grandfather wrote me before the trust was built, she said, placing it on the piano. I never read it, Sophia whispered. You will. When it's time. They sat in silence, side by side. Ruth reappeared in the doorway, barefoot now, holding the newspaper from the launch ceremony. You see this headline? She asked. Power rewritten. She folded the paper and added dryly. Took them long enough. Margaret looked at the photo on the front. 3 women, 3 timelines, 1 table. Her smile was faint, but full. Paper lasts longer than arrogance, she said. Sophia reached out, taking her hand. Peace wasn't a finish line, it was a season. And it had returned. Downstairs, the concierge sorted mail. Bills, flyers. One envelope addressed in Olivia's shaky scrawl was marked, Return to Sender. It never made it past the lobby. No one asked for forwarding. No one cared. In the study, Margaret placed the trust documents into the fireproof safe. She clicked it closed, the lock whispering into place like the last line of a story. Then she turned to Sophia and said simply, She got 12 million and mocked me as useless. Her eyes didn't blink. Her voice didn't shake. Days later, she crawled, while I held the real papers.